Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this fourth Chalmers Lecture. A particular welcome to those of you who are joining us to participate not only in this but also the HeartEdge conference. And a welcome, of course, to those of you who are participating in this lecture through the miracle of the internet. So we are a large company spread not just around this church but across Scotland and indeed across the world. So welcome, one and all. The plan for tonight is that we'll hear Sam deliver this lecture. There'll be time for questions, and after that there's a time to buy books, which is always goes down well, including the book that's tied into this lecture series. And I'm sure if Sam could be persuaded at no small cost to sign any copies you buy. No. Okay. And afterwards there'll be wine and nibbles and a chance to mingle and talk. So, without further ado, the Rev Dr Sam Wells. Sam.
Well, thank you again, George. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you again to the committee for entrusting me with the honour of delivering these lectures. And this lecture number 4 is entitled Entertaining Angels Unawares. It is more blessed to receive. Tonight I want to make 3 moves. The first is to try to dismantle the assumption that church and charity are both fundamentally personal matters, which shouldn't get entangled with social or political consequences or commitments. The second is to scrutinize conventional notions of charity, which can easily do more harm than good. The third is to articulate what good charity means and how that may best relate to congregational life. I end the lecture with a meditation on one particular social issue and how the gospel engages it. In the late 1960s, the second wave of the feminist movement started to use the phrase, "the personal is political." What the phrase meant was that many of the choices that women made or were denied the opportunity to make were not simply personal choices, but together constituted the heart of the way politics needed to be reimagined and reconfigured. Politics was fundamentally tangled up in the personal, and the personal was what the tangle of politics was all about. Issues of violence against women, of sexual health, of salary and working conditions, of the availability of affordable and high-quality daycare, and of the removal of impossible beauty standards from one's life were not private, personal questions. On the contrary, they were exactly what politics was about. The feminist movement taught many other minority and underrepresented groups that the key to social change was to expose and manifest the public significance of hitherto hidden and private personal struggles and sufferings. Such an insight has become a commonplace amongst activists today, for example, in the environmental movement. We're all encouraged to recognize that the future well-being of the planet doesn't just lie in international agreements made in Rio, Kyoto, and Copenhagen, but just as much in our decision to recycle our daily newspaper, ride a bike to work, and purchase locally grown vegetables. The phrase "the personal is the political" may have been invented in the 1960s, but the idea is not new. The idea is, in fact, at the heart of the Passion narrative. The power of the story of Jesus' suffering and death is that it's both an account of the greatest political tragedy in history, the death of the Son of God, and a display of the most profound and intimate personal and interpersonal interactions and betrayals. That's the whole point. It's never just about God, and it's never just about us. Jesus goes to the cross because we put him there, but also because God somehow chose to let him go there. The agony of the story is not just that Jesus gives his life to save the whole world, but that he lays down his life for his friends. It is personal and political and personal, all at the same time, and you can never disentangle the one from the other. When Judas kisses Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, his kiss is the most intimate, ironic form of betrayal. The act of love becomes the act of exposure. But that kiss is the most political thing Judas does in the whole story. Judas uses his personal knowledge of Jesus and his purposes and whereabouts, and turns that knowledge into political power by bringing a movement that challenged the Roman and Jewish status quo to an abrupt and violent end. Then, by the charcoal fire, Peter's personal need for warmth and his very human fear of being recognized and perhaps executed become a political changing of sides. A servant girl says, "You were with the Galilean," and in the process makes the motley crew of disciples sound more like a political party. When Peter denies it, he isn't just betraying his closest friend, he's putting his weight behind the Roman and Sadducean and Herodian domination of Galilee and Jerusalem. Again, when Pontius Pilate sits on the judgment seat, we see apparently the most political moment of all. Pilate asks if Jesus is the King of the Jews. He's in the habit of releasing one prisoner to the crowd. These are patently political dimensions of the story. But suddenly it gets very personal. Pilate's wife appears, and her message arrives at this most political moment with an extraordinarily personal touch. "I can't sleep, darling. I've had a terrible dream. It's been upsetting me all day. I've been dreaming about another man, not you. And the man I've been dreaming about is the man standing half naked in front of you right now. Don't kill him, please, whatever you do." It makes one wonder, did Pilate have Jesus executed out of realpolitik or out of jealousy? For political reasons or personal ones? Most poignantly, when Jesus dies on the cross, he calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some assume he's calling for Elijah and placing himself in the religious and political history of Israel's prophets, while others assume he's thirsty and take his cry in a more personal way by offering him a drink on the end of a stick. Moments later, the centurion looks on Jesus' dead body and concludes, "This man was God's son," which sounds like a personal statement of affirmation or even faith. But when one realizes this was a Roman soldier and his emperor claimed the title Son of God, it becomes evident it's not just a personal statement, but a deeply political one. To be a Christian means to follow Jesus' path to the cross in the hope of sharing with him in his resurrection. The Passion narrative gives us every indication that if we follow Jesus, we can expect some public acclaim, but eventual rejection. We can be weighed down like the disciples by human needs like sleepiness in the garden and shivering cold by the charcoal fire. But we can also be called to the most transcendent gestures, like Simon carrying Jesus' cross and Joseph stepping out of the shadows to offer a tomb. What we can't do is try to seal off parts of our lives. We can't say this part is personal and deny that it has any political significance. We can't say that part is political and thereby suppose it's immune from the call to discipleship. The difference between the personal and the political is meaningless to God. God sees it all. God knows it all. God wants it all. Whom do you eat with? What groceries do you buy? Who do you sit next to in church? Which route and what method of transport do you take to work? What literature do you read? Whom do you pray for? These intensely personal things constitute some of the most politically significant statements of our lives. Who do you know that came to this country in search of a better job? Who do you know that has had an unexpected and unplanned pregnancy? Who do you know whose father died in a war no one can remember the need for? These are supposed to be political questions, but issues are only generalizations about people. The political is intensely personal when we really allow ourselves to see it. In the first Holy Week, Peter, Judas, Simon of Cyrene, Mary Magdalene, and Joseph of Arimathea discovered that their most personal friendships, choices, and loves turned out to be the most political and dynamic dimensions of their lives. Discipleship requires each of us to make the same discovery. All of which highlights that there's no church or charity that isn't political and personal at the same time. Politics is revealed in the most personal choices and relationships of our lives. The biggest act of charity disciples do isn't the way they give away their money, it's with whom they choose to be in relationship. The biggest political act disciples perform is not how they cast their vote, but how they let the worship and witness of their church form their character. Likewise, there's no artificial distinction between church and charity. The first social action of the church is to be the church. That's by no means the church's only social action, but it's a recognition that being church is a political and social act of the first importance, even before it issues in other forms of action. Charity is the explicit public declaration and demonstration of who the church thinks it is and whom it believes it is called to be with. In a blistering attack on models of charity that were the norm in the 1890s and are still widely held today, Oscar Wilde makes a series of crisp observations that bear close attention more than 120 years after they were written. Dismissing the conventional compassion of his and our age, Wilde points out that most people are drawn to charity, but in a way that does no good. He maintains the majority of the people spoil their lives by an unhealthy and exaggerated altruism. They're surrounded by hideous poverty, ugliness, and starvation, and are accordingly moved by admirable, though misdirected intentions to remedy the evils around them. But what Wilde recognizes is that their remedies do not cure the disease, they merely prolong it. Indeed, their remedies are part of the disease. Wilde contends that most attempts at charity are misguided and often result in shoring up an unjust situation that needs to be exposed, allowed to fail, and replaced. Just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves, he says, and so prevented the horror of the system being realized by those who suffered from it and understood by those who contemplated it, so in the present state of things in England, the people who do most harm are the people who try to do most good. Wilde provocatively insists charity creates a multitude of sins, not least that it degrades and demoralizes its objects. Wilde is relentless in his argument that conventional notions of virtue compound the problem and need to be denounced. This is how he puts it. The virtues of the poor may readily be admitted and are much to be regretted. We are often told that the poor are grateful for charity. Some of them are, no doubt, but the best amongst the poor are never grateful. They are ungrateful, discontented, disobedient, and rebellious. They are quite right to be so. Charity they feel to be a ridiculously inadequate mode of partial restitution or a sentimental dole, usually accompanied by some impertinent attempt on the part of the sentimentalist to tyrannize over their private lives. Why should they be grateful for the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table? They should be seated at the board and are beginning to know it. As for being discontented, a person who would not be contented with such surroundings and such a low mode of life would be a perfect brute. Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is humankind's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion. In a similar vein, Wilde has no time for the well-worn distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. He is in no mood to hand out certificates to those of the poor that meet the wealthy's criteria for benevolence. Sometimes, he says, the poor are praised for being thrifty. But Wilde believes to recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. He maintains that a town or country labourer who practices thrift is demonstrating an ability to live like a badly fed animal. Wilde would prefer that such people should either steal or go on the rates, which is considered by many to be a form of stealing. He summarizes the alternatives like this: it is safer to beg than to take, but it is finer to take than to beg. He would much rather people be ungrateful, unthrifty, discontented, and rebellious, all of which are healthy forms of protest. He has little time for the so-called virtuous poor, whom he sees as objects of pity rather than admiration. They have made private terms with the enemy, he says, and sold their birthright for very bad pottage. They must also be extraordinarily stupid. Wilde doesn't understand why people who have no prospect of realizing what he calls some form of beautiful and intellectual life should accept laws that protect private property. He sees it as almost incredible how a person, quote, whose life is marred and made hideous by such laws can possibly acquiesce in their continuance. Wilde does have good news for the poor, yet it doesn't lie simply in the redistribution of wealth or any change in the democratic arrangements for elections, which in 1890 had a restricted franchise, not least in that they excluded women altogether. Instead, Wilde goes to the heart of what constitutes human flourishing and offers counsel on how best to foster it. He describes human flourishing as the development of what he calls personality, and he believes Jesus' purpose was to encourage the growth of such personality. Seeking to gain property is largely a distraction from this higher goal. This is Wilde's prescription. He says, Jesus moved in a community that allowed the accumulation of private property just as ours does. And the gospel that he preached was not that in such a community it is an advantage for a person to live on scanty, unwholesome food, to wear ragged, unwholesome clothes, to sleep in horrid, unwholesome dwellings, and a disadvantage for a person to live under healthy, pleasant, and decent conditions. What Jesus meant was this. He said to humankind, you have a wonderful personality. Develop it. Be yourself. Don't imagine that your perfection lies in accumulating or possessing external things. Your affection is inside of you. If only you could realize that, you would not want to be rich. Ordinary riches can be stolen from a person. Real riches cannot. In the treasury house of your soul, there are infinitely precious things that may not be taken from you. And so try to so shape your life that external things will not harm you. It's to be noted that Jesus never says that impoverished people are necessarily good or wealthy people necessarily bad. That would not have been true. There is only one class in the community that thinks more about money than the rich, and that is the poor. The poor can think of nothing else. That is the misery of being poor. What Jesus does say is that humankind reaches its perfection not through what it has, not even through what it does, but entirely through what it is. In these excoriating words, Wilde articulates a formidable critique of notions of charity that still abide today. Altruism, he argues, may often in origin be misguided, sentimental, and patronizing, and in outcome be counterproductive and pernicious. Trying to do good invariably serves the giver, but seldom benefits the recipient. That generosity for which the rich are often applauded and that humility for which the poor are commended most often leaves the status quo unchallenged and thus does more harm than good. Counsel given to the poor by the rich is generally grotesque and insulting. 70 years before Paulo Freire, Wilde argues that the best thing those who are not poor can do is to make the poor aware of their paralyzed consciousness, since, as he says, no class is ever really conscious of its own suffering. They have to be told of it by other people, and they often entirely disbelieve them. This was how the cause of abolition prevailed in the United States. Such agitators are indispensable, he believes, and the fate of the poor without them pitiful. For Wilde, the most tragic fact in the whole of the French Revolution is not that Marie Antoinette was killed for being a queen, but that the starved peasants of the Vendée voluntarily went out to die for the hideous cause of feudalism. Yet the solution to poverty is not to give everyone a property portfolio. Property can be a burden as much as a blessing. It is at best only ever a means to an end. The key to flourishing is to realize that we realize our potential not through what we have, not even through what we do, but entirely through what we are. In characteristically radical terms, Wilde goes on to challenge the whole way charity is conventionally and almost universally founded on compassion, and on what he takes to be an inaccurate notion of unselfishness. These are the words with which he apparently undermines, but in fact releases, the potential of true charity. Selfishness is not living as one wishes to live, it is asking others to live as one wishes to live. And unselfishness is letting other people's lives alone, not interfering with them. Selfishness always aims at creating around it an absolute uniformity of type. Unselfishness recognizes infinite variety of type as a delightful thing, accepts it, acquiesces in it, enjoys it. A red rose is not selfish because it wants to be a red rose. It would be horribly selfish if it wanted all the other flowers in the garden to be both red and roses. Up to the present, humanity has hardly cultivated sympathy at all. It has merely sympathy with pain, and sympathy with pain is not the highest form of sympathy. All sympathy is fine, but sympathy with suffering is the least fine mode. It is tainted with egotism. It is apt to become morbid. There is in it a certain element of terror for our own safety. We become afraid that we ourselves might be as the leper or as the blind, and that no one would have care of us. It is curiously limiting, too. One should sympathize with the entirety of life, not with life's sores and maladies merely, but with life's joy and beauty and energy and health and freedom. The wider sympathy is, of course, the more difficult. It requires more unselfishness. Anybody can sympathize with the sufferings of a friend, but it requires a very fine nature to sympathize with a friend's success. Wilde is proposing that charity be founded not on compassion or pity, nor even enlightened self-interest, and still less a patronizing desire to teach a man to fish, but on a genuine quest for true companionship. Now that would be something. Oscar Wilde's criticisms are profound. They're worth quoting because they offer not just reasons to evaluate charity carefully, but a possible alternative vision. Nonetheless, his skepticism about charity is shared by many inside and beyond the church. Misgivings about charity can be grouped into concerns about the purpose, methods, and outcomes. Concerns about the purpose begin with the general observation that charity tends to be about the heart more than the head. Some would say about the egoist's desire to leave a mark rather than the altruist's lack of care about who gets the credit. Charitable endeavours do not always begin from extensive research and close understanding about the issues they seek to address. They are not always mindful of the range of effects and side effects an intervention might cause or trigger. They can be dominated by the needs and projections of the activist and donor and pay little regard to the actual circumstances of the recipient or beneficiary. They tend to run on a deficit model that focuses on what is lacking in the recipient and what is abundant in the activist or donor, and thus undermine the qualities in the beneficiary on which future well-being will depend. They can rely on emotional appeal, with the result that donors give out of compassion rather than wisdom, and sentimental causes benefit while more sophisticated needs miss out. Giving can be driven just as much by a company's desire to look good or by individual donors' quests to find tax loopholes as from genuine concern about issues and people, still less to restore true relationship among people. As to methods, these concerns are in many cases closely related to the motivations. The words volunteer and amateur have very positive origins, but can easily be associated with things not being done with care and professionalism. A charity that is shaped largely or wholly by the activist's or donor's passionate perception of desperate crisis or crying tragedy is unlikely to pay careful attention to what other organizations are doing, and may have been doing for a long time, slow to learn lessons that others have gleaned, and reluctant to form partnerships to maximize effectiveness. The fact that there are around 200,000 registered charities in the UK and 200 homeless charities in London alone speaks of the sector's notorious tendencies to multiplication and duplication. Relatively few charities have on their boards significant representation from the groups they seek to serve. Thus, decisions are too often taken that reflect the presuppositions of the activist and donor rather than the genuine vision of the beneficiary. Since charity is often focused on the desire to act rather than the aspiration to change, impact assessments can be weak and accountability lines can be absent. There never seems time to review how things went last time in the eagerness to keep doing more. As to fundraising, there are always concerns about whether charities abide by best practice in presenting their case and respecting donors, and always the danger that major donors or corporations will constrain the way their money is spent. When a charity's income is over-dependent on a small number of sources, it's open to manipulation. Meanwhile, there's often suspicion of Christian charities that their real aim is the dissemination of the faith, rather than the autonomous well-being of the beneficiary. When it comes to outcomes, which is Oscar Wilde's main concern, the passionate desire to change the world can often result in the wrong kind of change. An abiding concern for many is that charities simply let governments off the hook by conducting work that should come out of the public purse. Another frequent worry is that charities foster a codependent culture where their clients become habituated to using their services, and the charities themselves need the clients to justify their existence. Charities can become part of a system. The frequent user can learn to play such a system, while the genuinely needy can become lost within it. Such misgivings drive clarity about motivations, methods, and outcomes. They also encourage vigilance about spotting the moment when a goodwill gesture becomes an institutional program. Keeping Wilde's vivid critique and these wider misgivings in mind, it's time to review what anyone, church or beyond, might be trying to do through charitable or other benevolent action. Since these more fundamental questions are too seldom asked, it may be helpful to explore them before making further proposals. Rather than draw up categories and select between them, it may be most illuminating to begin with perhaps the most obvious kind of charitable endeavour, feeding the hungry, and then assess what makes it more or less suitable as an aspiration. If there are 7.6 billion people in the world, then around 815 million, or just over 1 in 10, is suffering from chronic undernourishment. Meanwhile, the number of people affected each year by hydrological, meteorological, climatological, geophysical or biological disasters, that's to say floods, storms, droughts, earthquakes and diseases, is around 400 million. These numbers dwarf any other measurement of human need. One would therefore imagine that all charitable efforts would be directed to overseas development aid or humanitarian relief unless there were pressing reasons to the contrary. In fact, only 10% of UK charitable giving goes to overseas aid and disaster relief, and only 19% of adults who give to charity regularly give to such causes. There are a number of drawbacks to such charities. It's very difficult for the donor to see the results of their support. It's just as difficult for a supporter to play any significant role in the charity besides giving money and encouraging others to do so. There is almost no prospect of face-to-face encounter between supporters and beneficiaries. It requires a bureaucratic system of wise distribution, dependent on professional staff and local partners on the ground in development regions or disaster zones. There is nothing a volunteer can usefully do. There are numerous pitfalls in regard to the conduct of professional staff, the durability and standards of local partners, issues of waste, maldistribution and endemic corruption in local cultures, and the perpetual balance between humanitarian relief and political agitation in richer and poorer nations that seeks to interrupt the perpetuation of circumstances that make populations so vulnerable. In a larger perspective, seeing people or nations only as the recipient of charity can be humiliating and degrading in the way that Oscar Wilde identifies. Scrutinizing such drawbacks reveals a good deal about what makes for good charity. Good charity sees the donor as more than just a source of money and the recipient as more than simply a needy cause. Good charity cares not just for the beneficiary's survival, but for their dignity, well-being, network of relationships, ability to earn a living, education, training, health, and general flourishing, not least their ability to be a benefactor to others. Good charity recognizes not only the powerlessness of the recipient to bring about the changes in their life they long to see, but also the powerlessness of the donor to feel that they are enhancing people's capacity and helping them realize their potential, rather than compounding the problem by perpetuating humiliation or cultivating dependency. Good charity recognizes that human problems are more often about isolation and the fragility of relationships than about limitation and the shortage of materials, and that efforts to overcome limitation by supplying materials or technology can end up increasing isolation by undermining networks of relationship. Good charity does not seek to make the recipient more like the donor, but catalyzes a journey in which both donor and recipient may grow and flourish, ideally but not always through coming to know, respect and learn from each other. And this is why Oscar Wilde's swingeing criticism of conventional well-meaning benevolence is so important. He is well aware of the familiar motivations of guilt, self-importance, duty, evangelism and pity that pervade the charitable scene then and now. But beyond these, he identifies one rather more subtle desire. Consider again these words: selfishness is not living as one wishes to live, it is asking others to live as one wishes to live. And unselfishness is letting other people's lives alone, not interfering with them. Selfishness always aims at creating around it an absolute uniformity of type. Unselfishness recognizes infinite variety of type as a delightful thing, accepts it, acquiesces in it, enjoys it. What Wilde puts his finger on is the narcissistic impulse to recreate the world in the image of ourselves. This impulse is then presented as charity. In fact, anything significantly different from ourselves is problematic. We struggle with the successes of others as much as we do their failures. Here is Wilde's crucial sentence: one should sympathize with the entirety of life, not with life's sores and maladies merely, but with life's joy and beauty and energy and health and freedom. One might almost say, love keeps no score of wrongs, but rejoices in the good. Charity is not a foul-weather friend that thrives on another's hardship, nor a rescuer that cannot see what a person is, only what they can become with assistance that is provided on the rescuer's terms. Charity seeks life's joy and beauty and energy and health and freedom, yet chooses not to seek such things alone, but in the company of those for whom others might suppose such things were out of reach. This is the secret of good charity, not to carry around solutions and hunt for those with suitable problems from whom you may derive pleasure in supplying a fix, not to civilize the world by making it an image of yourself, not to subcontract your guilt and pay off the distressing calls of need from your gate with a regular retainer to one who will venture where you disdain to go, not to immerse yourself in others' pain so as to feel better about your shortcomings or hardships, but to allow your life to be harnessed to those whose talent you believe in but have not yet seen, whose potential is limitless but you have not yet witnessed, whose joy is elusive but you long to share, whose grasp of beauty will transform yours, and whose freedom once attained will make your choices seem tawdry and limited. This is what it means to say it is better to receive than to give. The world's problem is not that there are too many poor and the wealthy should give. It's that the joy in life is creativity, relationship, and growth, and the poor are poor to the extent that they don't have outlets for such things. And charity means creating and becoming outlets for such things. Charity requires a step of faith, but that faith is not that you have a problem to which I must be able to find a solution. It's that you have a pearl inside you, and by steadiness, durability, solidarity, trustworthiness, encouragement, and companionship, I must be able to help you bring that pearl into the glowing sunshine to be beheld in all its glory. Most mission is about individuals encountering God in the world, beyond the church, in unsystematic and often unanticipated ways through personal encounter with the stranger. There is no reason or need to structure or rationalize such encounters. There is no necessity to take away their spontaneity or ingenuousness. No effort to organize charitable endeavors or mission initiatives should diminish or discredit the priority and simplicity of authentic human encounter. Nonetheless, just as there is good reason to marshal efforts at achieving a sustainable income into a concerted venture into commercial life, so there are appropriate motives for organizing outreach initiatives into a specific legally constituted charity. These include tax advantages in gift aid, VAT, and business rates, But the structural aspects are about creating an organization that people can participate in, grant-making bodies, benefactors, and sometimes statutory bodies can fund, and accountability structures can scrutinize without getting tangled up in the life of a congregation. This has many dimensions. It means that if the circumstances of the congregation change, the charity can continue largely unaffected. Accounts are kept entirely separately, and the venture is recognized as having its own identity, separate from but largely in accord with the purposes of the church. It anticipates a time when the congregation and the charity may become entirely separate in premises, identity, purpose, governance, and personnel. It means that a person who is a member of another congregation can work or volunteer for the charity without appearing to change their loyalties, or donate to the charity without that becoming confused with their tithe to their own church. It means a person of another faith or of no professed faith can gladly work for, volunteer with, or donate to the charity without feeling compromised by becoming regarded as an honorary congregation member. Likewise, a statutory authority, grant maker, or company social or employees fund may exclude donations to churches but may be quite content to contribute to an independent charity. Moreover, the beneficiary of the initiative may be more comfortable being brought into the life of a charity or a particular one or two of its employees or volunteers than being embraced by a congregation. Together, this clear water between a congregation and a charity makes it helpfully evident what the charity does that only a charity can do, and what the congregation does that only a congregation can do, without preventing individuals being involved in some capacity in both at the same time. All of which is not to say that the transition is always easy or beneficial. It's not just that the process of becoming a charity can be demanding, complex, and protracted. The requirement that all activities be charitable is too rigorous for many. Rules around trusteeship and campaigning activities may keep the charity focused on good operation and core activities. But the real issue for a small charity is the weight of administration, the heavy responsibility, and the skills required to keep accounts, submit returns, and embody good governance. In the process, the hand-to-mouth, happy-go-lucky character of a voluntary initiative can be inhibited and the enjoyment much reduced. People may say, we're not a family anymore, and they're often right, because a family has a certain exclusivity, non-transparency, hierarchy, conflict of interest, and familiarity that's explicitly ruled out by a charitable structure. And while this is usually a very good thing, there's no doubt there can be genuine losses too. For all these reasons, the decision on whether to establish a formal charity needs to be a local and circumstantial one. But the overall ethos has to be the one provoked by Oscar Wilde and described earlier as the transformation of a burden into a gift. Charity or compassionate outreach is not a weighty duty a congregation takes on because it feels guilty about the plight of those less fortunate than itself. It's a glad response to the angels God is sending the congregation's way, and a decision to create and resource a specialized form of encounter with them. Such an encounter is about the congregation making new discoveries in faith and the theoretical beneficiaries finding truer living, greater hope, and fuller expression for their creativity and talents. It's the attitude of expectation and the mutual desire to learn and grow that preserves such an initiative from patronizing interference, reinforcing inequality. Such a venture does not drain a church of energy and resources. It renews a congregation through the energy and challenge of people on whom many, perhaps most communities, would customarily turn their back. I want to finish with a scriptural engagement that points to renewal around the issue I most often encounter. I offer this meditation in an attempt to model the kind of understanding provoked by Oscar Wilde and arising from the reflections of this lecture. To be street homeless, to be a person who sleeps outside, is to face many challenges every day. The day probably begins early. The patch on which you're sleeping is likely to be needed as an access door, or your presence is challenged by a park attendant or security guard. Immediately you have to work out where to put your things, how to source some breakfast, where to charge your phone. Then the day begins in earnest. It's largely spent seeking to improve your situation in the short term by gaining some income, by doing some casual work, or in some cases begging, and in the long term by seeking to address your health needs, any other bureaucratic obstacles, and ideally making yourself more ready for regular work and finding some more sustainable accommodation. In the process, you build up a network of relationships with places you can get cardboard to sleep on, a sausage to chew on, hot water for tea, and space to leave your belongings. Maybe there's a support worker who can assist you, another homeless person you can talk to, or an agency that will give you a chance to wash, do laundry, find nutritious food, and human company. People become homeless for all kinds of reasons. People remain homeless for a bunch more. People sometimes become homeless again after a more stable season, and the majority of people who are homeless find a way to exist that doesn't involve sleeping outside. But every category of homelessness is characterized by one common feature: shame. Shame because you're without most of the sources of dignity and prestige our culture prizes. You have no home and therefore no castle. Your clothes are rough and unstylish. You face daily humiliation by having to ask others for food, money, respect, assistance, eye contact. You risk constant judgment that you have brought this situation about through your own shortcomings. You have little security, few if any friends, little trust, a very small foundation on which to build a better future. All of us know what it feels like to be embarrassed, humiliated, exposed, judged, rejected, crushed. It's what we strive to avoid with all our hearts. But to be homeless is not just to feel these things, it's to feel them all the time. We can get a particular perspective on homelessness if we consider the parable of the great banquet in Luke chapter 14. The parable comes in 4 scenes. In scene 1, a man invites the great and the good to a grand dinner and begins to make preparations. The story takes for granted that everyone wants to come to that dinner. Why might anyone possibly say no? In scene 2, the dinner is served and a servant duly goes to collect the guests. But here comes the shock. One guest says he needs to inspect some land, another says he's bought 10 oxen, a third says he's just got married. Now, it would be easy to say how unfortunate, it's disappointing when you want your friends to come over and it turns out they're all busy. But that would be to miss the point. In the first place, these people have already promised to come and make no effort to say otherwise until the food is already prepared. In the second place, they're all offering excuses about things they would have been aware of plenty of time in advance. In the third place, their excuses are phrased in such a way as to cause maximum offense. The field is something that could obviously have waited. The oxen is a huge investment, but one that requires meticulous calculation to match each pair in strength and size, and thus not something likely to be done in one evening. While the third is a crude and culturally inexcusable statement that the invitee is so taken up with the pleasures of the flesh that he has no regard for his host's hospitality. The result is that the host is utterly humiliated. He could be angry, vengeful, bitter, and vindictive. Many of us are when the shroud of shame falls upon us and the light of dignity is removed from us. Whatever their motives, the guests have set out to cause wholesale humiliation, and they've succeeded. But the host doesn't internalize the embarrassment or turn shame into anger. In scene 3, he improvises and says, "Why don't we give the food to someone who wants it? Why don't we turn a formal function into a playful party?" He instructs his servant to go around the town inviting those who would never normally be invited to any such gathering, because whether through their social or their physical condition, they know what it means to experience perpetual shame. In other words, in the heat of his shame, he chose to share what he had with those who knew shame better than he did. But it turns out that even when the shamed of the town are invited, there are still seats left at the table. This tells us just how many of the original guests, beyond the 3 whose excuses are recorded, must have turned the host down. So in scene 4, the host tells the slaves to go beyond the town limits and into the countryside and find the ultra-shamed. That's to say, whoever is so ostracized, they're cast out from the town altogether. Before making a connection to a congregation's own context, it's important to see how this anticipates the story of Christ's passion. Jesus is first tried among those whom one might expect to welcome his ministry. He's then paraded through the streets and lanes of Jerusalem and is exposed to humiliation and scorn. Finally, he's taken outside the city to the highways and byways and is put to death by the most shameful method known to the ancient world. But he doesn't internalize that shame. Instead, he expresses forgiveness to his persecutors, and in due course, through his resurrection, he turns that shame into grace. The cruelty and injustice of his tormentors he turns into hospitality and hope. The heart of the banquet story is the same as the heart of the gospel. Shame and loss become grace and joy. Now we may examine a congregation's context and reflect on 3 kinds of homelessness. The first is the plight of the person whose life has got into such a crisis, whose relationships are so fragile or non-existent, whose legal rights are so inadequate and whose options are so exhausted that they experience the daily shame of being regarded as shiftless, pitiful, and a lost cause. The second is the members of the congregation's own homelessness. Many are searching, some are isolated, others pine for belonging, relationship, home, acceptance, or an end to prejudice, exposure, failure, humiliation, or scorn. If you ask people, why do you like spending time with homeless people, and you really want to wait for their reply, the answer almost always is, because it helps me recognize and understand and find companionship in my own homelessness. It's the same journey from shame to grace. But there's a third kind of homelessness, and that's what we get a glimpse of in the parable. Jesus is saying, then and now, I have no home but yours. Yours is the heart where I belong. Yours is the home I long to enter. Yours is the life I long to resurrect. Yours are the burdens I long to share. And the door is continually closed or slammed in his face. That is the shame of God, not just on the cross, but today, every minute, from those from whom we might most expect there to be a welcome. The homelessness of the streets, the homelessness of ourselves, the homelessness of God. There's a moment when these 3 kinds of homelessness come together, and that's at the Eucharist, where Gentiles celebrate that God's invitation went not just to God's own people, the Jews, but to those who were in the highways and byways, the Eucharist, in which the rejected of the world, the failures of our lives, and the broken heart of God meet. The Eucharist in which the shroud of shame is lifted and the banquet of grace begins, where a formal function becomes a playful party, and injustice, ignominy, and isolation are transformed into joy. The promise of charity is that by sustained attention to one group of excluded or challenged people, members of a congregation will find the ordinary practices of their lives transformed into such a Eucharist. This is how compassion renews the church. Thank you.
for me, lots to think about there, I'm sure for you too. But also perhaps things you want to ask and explore a little further in this question time. So to you here and indeed to those of you watching online, this is a time when we can ask questions and look for some answers. Who would like to start?
I'll start, since I've got the microphone. But I've only got it to take round to other people. But just having a conversation earlier, I'm minister here at Greyfriars, and somebody asked the question, so with your Grassmarket project, where's the church there? And where's the church? What's the relationship? And I said, well, maybe the challenge, and I've got to be careful here because there are members of my congregation here tonight, maybe the challenge is that the community project is here in the church, and the church is the community project. That there's something about the human flourishing and the gift of seeing lives transformed and the capacity and inner strength that you see emerging in people that really is quite transformative. And there's something about the church that is actually sometimes quite rigid and quite conformist. And I'm thinking to myself, how can we bridge that gap to see that this stuff that is often going on the edge is actually where we bump into Jesus? Sometimes more often than we bump into him in our congregational life.
Okay, so to respond to that, and as Richard knows, I'm one of the greatest admirers of the work of this congregation and of the Grassmarket community. Let's start from first principles. Ministry is about creating good environments where you can more or less rely on the Holy Spirit showing up. I'll say that again. Ministry is about creating good environments where you can more or less rely on the Holy Spirit showing up. It's the Holy Spirit that does the transformation, not you. Ministry is about creating the circumstances. So that's point number one. The second is, why is it that historically churches have been so invested in healthcare and education? Well, anybody who spends a lot of time in healthcare or education will tell you those are the two most reliable places where you see people's lives change. You see people's lives change when they get better in a hospital or through medication or through other kinds of care. You see people's lives change when they learn who Socrates was or what a Van de Graaff generator does, although I'm not exactly sure I remember the second one of those in great detail. That's where you see people's eyes open and scales fall from people's eyes and lives change. So the church is engaged in those things, not because the church is so wonderful and it needs to make other people as wonderful as itself. That's the point that Oscar Wilde is making about selfishness. It's not creating clones of oneself. It's because it wants to behold the amazing things the Holy Spirit does. Now, formal worship should be about the minister creating the right environment in which you can pretty much rely on the fact that the Holy Spirit shows up. However, formal worship can dry up in the same way as any reservoir can dry up. And you can find a situation where you've got a hole in the ground rather than a lake. And I'm not saying that's ever happened to any church that I've ever been to, but friends of mine tell me it happens at their churches occasionally. And so sometimes members of a congregation need to have the humility to step just 100 yards down the road and see where the Holy Spirit is turning up every day, and then say, I think we need to make our worship a little bit more like what those guys are doing, because they seem to be having a pretty good time. And that is how mission and charity renew the church.
Okay, questions.
Thank you. You've given us a good account of the way in which the term charity has become degraded, or maybe always was, and how it can be renewed. You didn't speak, I think, in this lecture about love, and yet charity and love are the same thing. I mean, would it help to include love as being part of the understanding of charity, or is the term love also degraded in the same way?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I guess the criticisms that Oscar Wilde made. I mean, I pulled out Oscar Wilde because it's a long time ago. It might seem like a white male from 120 years ago. What's he got to say to our multicultural society today? But it's kind of almost embarrassing how contemporary Oscar Wilde's criticisms are, and because he's much wittier than I am, it makes more sense to quote him than to try to attempt to do a similar job. But his criticisms of charity name and nail pretty accurately the potential shortcomings of love. Because sadly, many of the wrongs in the world come not from a lack of love, but from love not knowing how to love well. I'm not going to go into details on that, but many relationships get into difficulties not because there's no love there, but because love can come out in very clumsy and selfish and sentimental and inappropriate ways. So I think that what I said and what I quoted Oscar Wilde saying about charity, almost all of that applies to love. I mean, I'm just going to think, I guess, of the parent who finds that their child doesn't seem to need them as much as they did at an earlier stage, sort of subconsciously recognizes that they preferred the earlier stage, and that actually the other forms of life meaning that they'd found their way to before their child was at that needy stage, they have got out of the habit of exercising, and so they will go to almost any lengths to keep the child needy and dependent on them, which is not really in any sense about the flourishing of the child, but about their own shortcomings in how well to love. Now, nobody here has ever met a parent that acted in such a way. I'm just telling a parable that has no touch on anybody here's lives, or either of their own parents or their own parenting, or anybody you might ever have known. But that just illustrates the way that love can be manipulative, can be very selfish. Even the parent that has loved their profession and longs for the child to go into the same profession may on some level be guilty of the kind of selfishness that Oscar Wilde is talking about. Are you going to be like your dad? Think of that through Oscar Wilde's lenses, the loadedness of that question. And somehow the friend of the family kind of likes it when they're going to be like their dad or like their mum. That may or may not be in the best interests of the child at all, particularly the child that, for example, inherits the family company and has no aptitude or interest in business, but it happens all the time. So I guess my answer to your question, which is a wonderful question, is to say I don't think we can use the word love and therefore produce the sort of joker that trumps all the other cards. I think love is subject to the same blind alleys and wrong steps as I've been talking about in relation to charity. The one thing I would say is that what I was trying to come to at the end of the lecture was a description of what charity truly is, which is to walk with somebody and long for and pray for and yearn for the fact that you will, in the process of walking with them, enjoy and experience and relish and delight in their increasing flourishing. Well, that's not a bad definition of love.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and Very enlightening. I just have I was struck by one of your statements when you said that charity is not about teaching a man how to fish, but about true companionship. And now I just place it back in a part of where I've grown up in Pakistan, in a developing country. It's very much part of how I grew up, in the sense that if you have any education or any kind of resources, you are forever helping those on the street, you're pulling people in to give them food or whatever. But to take that step, as you say, often my parents used to say, teach them how to fish. To become a true companion is quite difficult to do it on a daily basis, because that's where it's, your family. How do you put that into that context?
Well, I'm going to take the risk of being pious now, because I know because you're a Muslim I should not try to convert you. But I've never really felt that was an appropriate rule to keep. So I'm now going to try and convert you. And in the most pious way possible. I think Jesus found it very difficult too. So how did Jesus do it? The question you're asking is a question that leads me to an account of the incarnation. It is very difficult to be in relationship with someone, and you'd much rather send them an email which connects them to a YouTube video that tells them how to fish, and then it's sort of off your desk. Do it all by remote control, literally. However, what is fundamentally wrong with the world? What's fundamentally wrong with the world is not that there is a lack of fishing rods, or even a lack of widespread knowledge about the fishing industry, either on a personal or an industrial level. What's wrong with the world is the breakdown of relationship. That person doesn't have a web of trusted relationships where the knowledge of fishing comes, with mother's milk or in the water, depending on the metaphor that seems most appropriate. Probably depending on whether the water's clean. So that's the problem. And so the fundamental human problem, as Christianity understands it, is the breakdown in relationship. Our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with the creation, our relationship with one another, and fundamentally our relationship with God. The incarnation is God's answer to that problem, which is to walk with us. And many people have heard me say this before, sometimes probably too often, but I'm still going to I've got the microphone, so I get to say it again, which is, Jesus spent about a week fixing our problems, working for us in Jerusalem. He spent 3 years in Galilee working with us, teaching us to fish, empowering the disciples. He spent 30 years in Nazareth just walking with us, not fixing anything or solving anything, just making relationship. For some reason, we all think we know how to do an incarnation better than God. We've all done several of these before. We do them at school. We go to college and we get a master's in doing incarnations, and we know how to do it. And so we reverse the percentages, and we think it's all about the week in Jerusalem where we do this dramatic transformational intervention, maybe a little bit of empowerment, and there's never any time for the being with, the 90% in Nazareth. I think we should be a bit more humble than that and do it the way God does it. Not just out of humility that that's the way God does it, in other words, spending all our time restoring relationship, but because if we hope to be in heaven, there will be no problems to fix. There will not even be any empowerment to bring about through our social activism. There will only be being with one another, with ourselves, with God and the renewed creation. So why not get used to it now?
It's just a wondering. You talked about recipients and donors. And as you were talking about it, I was looking around and I was thinking to myself, I wonder if we consider ourselves recipients or donors. Because I think that who decides? So when I look around the room, I see a lot of recipients. I'd be happy to be a donor to you guys. But I wonder, when we talk about it, who decides which one of us is which?
I guess that's very much in the same trajectory as the Oscar Wilde inspired criticism. I talked at an earlier occasion about Ludwig Feuerbach's criticism of Christianity, which basically in 1841, in his book The Essence of Christianity, made the point that we, people in general, want to create social structures that make them feel better than other people. And the church becomes such a social structure, and God becomes the name of the way in which the church feels it's better than everybody else. I just think that's the most savage criticism of Christianity out there. It's just too uncomfortably true. Even of the remarkable and unique congregations that I've had the privilege to serve, so who knows what it's like for the others. And I think there's a danger about charity that it becomes a way, in an analogous way, you can see where I'm going with this, it becomes an analogous way to what Feuerbach says about the church. Charity becomes a way in which we guarantee our status as always a donor and as not being needy, and as being self-sufficient. And the irony, and the painful irony for me about the nostrums of contemporary society, is the way our professional ethos, and particularly our ethics of healthcare, are now mesmerized by the notion of autonomy. Because the autonomous person, who all our medical ethics are designed to foster and respect and honor, is the person that has no need of receiving from anybody and is independent. Literally, the clue's in the word, independent. They're just not dependent. And so, in other words, the goal of our society is to make us all people who never need to be recipients. I think that would be a miserable society if we ever absurdly were to achieve such a status. Society is about reciprocity. It's about mutuality. It's about me having some things to give you and you having some things to give me. And so eventually getting to the point where the giving and receiving, we're past that stage and we just enjoy being together. That's what relationship is about.
My question in a way has been answered, but I just wanted to share a little story, because one of my great struggles is to know how to receive, and I feel that there is a need for the church to be converted in order to understand what it means to receive as well as to give. And the story I wanted to share is I've been following the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, and had spent about 10 days on the pilgrimage route and had not been very well most of the time. And I'd got myself back to Lyon station, and I was sitting with my rucksack on a bench. And a woman came up to me and she said, "Would you like some food to eat?" And I said, "No, that's okay. I'm not hungry." But what I felt was, I don't need any food to eat because I have 200 euros in my pocket, and I'm not like one of them. I'm not a homeless person. And I have felt great shame for the last year and a half that I was able to react in that way, because actually it spoke of the rich man who despised the poor sinner. And it felt that I was somebody who was only capable, had only ever learned to give, but had never really learnt to receive. And I see that in many congregations. And one of the challenges, and I don't know whether you're able to comment on, how can we help people within the church, like me, to receive as well as to give?
Thank you for that very honest story. Just two things to say about it. Well, the first thing to say is I love a question that starts by saying you've already answered all my questions. That if any of you want some inspiration how to start a question, that's the best way to do it. The second thing to say is that it's quite fashionable to say, I hate all those bits in the Bible in Joshua about, smiting the Midianites and the wrath of God and all that kind of stuff. I don't actually struggle with all that part of the Bible. I really struggle with one verse in the Bible, which is in the book of Acts, where Jesus is attributed to say it's more blessed to give than to receive. Because everything I've been talking about, as you've very appropriately illustrated, is that the most imaginative and helpful giving, more often than not, is actually imaginative receiving. Because most of us flourish by longing to give, to create, to offer, to be of use in other people's lives, to matter to other people. And you very humbly told a story about where somebody was longing to give and to express maybe something they'd made themselves to be of use and to matter to you, and you said, actually, I'm fine, thanks, I'm independent, I've got the euros in my pocket. And all I can do is respond with another story, not from my experience, but from the experience of a friend who I stayed with in Malawi a few years ago, who was a very high-powered doctor, and she told me about a ward round that she had, where she went to, in a hospital that you can only imagine what it was like, and they dealt with the most minor patients first, and families kept sort of scratching at her doctor's coat, and she was trying to teach some of the local medical students as she went round, and you can only imagine what was on the floor, and there were some people there weren't beds for, and so there were people lying on the floor under some of the beds, and this was just a normal ward round for her, and she went to all of these beds in the kind of minor injuries and minor illnesses clinic, and then she went on to the more serious and the more distressing illnesses, and a man came up to her and was pulling on her coat, and she lost her temper, and she saw it was a person she'd already seen in the minor illnesses clinic. She couldn't actually offer him much, and she just turned on him and said, look, you see how many patients I've got to deal with. I'm not sure I've got time to get round to see all the most serious people today. Just give me a break. I've told you there's nothing I can do for you. I'll come back and see you in 3 days. And he held out to her his food ration and said, I saw you weren't looking your best today. I wondered if you wanted to share my beans. And of course, it was a life-changing moment for her, because she realized that she'd got so fixated on what I call working for, on her need to give, and that she'd lost sight of all the grace of the sense of the joy of being a doctor and being involved in the transformation of medicine, and she'd just started to see all the people there as obstacles. It took an experience like that from somebody who was longing to make it a reciprocal relationship in which he could give something of his while she was giving something of hers, that became a transformative experience for her.
So we'll have one more question, then I think we'll take the chance to mix and mingle.
We talk a lot about the time Jesus spent with the materially poor. He also spent time with the well-off. And often it seems to me the powerful and the well-off are spiritually the most impoverished. Is there a gospel for the rich?
Yeah, I would agree that in my experience the powerlessness of the rich can be as poignant as the powerlessness of the poor. I think particularly of a woman, one of the wealthiest people that I've known well. I'm sure there's a better way of saying that, but of all the people I've known, she would be perhaps the wealthiest. And I remember actually being in a restaurant in the town in which she lived, and being with a friend on one side of the restaurant, seeing her with her daughter on the other side of the restaurant. And I didn't go up and say hello, but I saw a lot of people, one after another, go up and talk to her. And of course, what they were doing were trying to bend her arm and say, could you be the patron of this, and could you sponsor me for that, and could you give 10,000 to the roof appeal for the other? And I just saw the misery of her isolation, that what she didn't have was the thing in life that I most cherish, which is reciprocal relationships of the kind that I was just describing to our friend across the aisle, of people who love me just for me, not because I can do anything for them, just because I'm Sam, and I love them because they're whoever they are. And she had almost no relationships like that. Everyone just saw a dollar sign when they saw her and could only think of how they could use her. There was no question of enjoying her. So, the gospel for her is to become part of a community where people really do get to enjoy you for who you are. And at the risk, again, of being rather simplistic and pious, I would say try a normal local congregation. Because that is the way in which you make those kind of relationships. St Martin-in-the-Fields is a wonderful place, and one of the things that makes it a wonderful place is we have, a couple of really quite famous people in the congregation who just sit in their ordinary clothes, and people know them by their first name and don't genuflect when they walk into the building. And of course that is their salvation. That's why they come. So the gospel of the rich is to spend time amongst people for whom your dollar sign is not the most interesting thing or significant thing about you. That can then empower you to use your gifts. And of course, sometimes when you're assessing the possibilities of the charity, you do a SWOT analysis and you look at your strengths and your weaknesses and your opportunities and your threats. And the strength might be that, Julie there in row 3 has got a whole packet of money. Well, that's one of our strengths. We can use that. But it only becomes transformative if that arises in a context where the people in that conversation don't see your money as the thing that defines you.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Sam, again, for being so thoughtful and attentive to the questions. I think we draw this bit to a close. I'm assured there's wine and nibbles, but more importantly, you need to sweep past the bookstall, where there's not only previous books from the pen of Sam Wells, but also the new book built around these lectures. So let's do that. We've got a good till 8 o'clock or so to do that. And in the meantime, on behalf of everyone here and those who are sharing with us online, could I say thank you, Sam, for another thought-provoking evening. Thank you.